Monday, October 14th, 1985 was Columbus Day, and Steve Christensen was marking the holiday by chasing his 3 young sons around his big sunlit living room. His wife Terry stood next to the fireplace, smiling with a hand on her very pregnant belly, and every time Steve looked over at her, he couldn't believe how beautiful she looked. She was absolutely glowing. Steve stopped running around to catch his breath. He was only 31 years old, but everyone said he seemed older, and today he felt older too. He was tall and broad-shouldered with thick brown hair and an air of seriousness about him. Steve's number one goal in life was to provide for his family, and he'd worked hard so they could have their nice home here in Salt Lake City, Utah. As his boys crowded around him, still wanting to play, Steve suddenly felt a pang of guilt. He knew he had not been spending enough time with his family lately because he had been so consumed with work. But Steve didn't feel like he had any other options. 2 months ago, the financial consulting company that he had helped build had gone under, leaving Steve almost bankrupt. Now he was trying to launch a new consulting business with a friend, and he was working overtime basically every week to get this new company off the ground. Steve told his sons they could play for a few more minutes, and so they did, and then afterwards he stood up and he walked over to Terry to rub her shoulders. He knew she was exhausted from the pregnancy and that she didn't like him working all the time, but Steve also knew he and his wife could make it through hard times. Not only did they have each other, but they also had their faith in the Mormon Church. Steve was a bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as the Mormons are officially known, and Terry was a devoted member. Literally half the population of Salt Lake City was Mormon, and Steve loved it. He and his growing family were surrounded by a big supportive community. But Steve's interest in Mormonism went well beyond his faith. He also collected historic Mormon artifacts like letters, books, and other documents that cataloged the church's past. Before his financial problems began, Steve used to buy and sell these 19th century antiques all the time. He'd even donated rare historical documents to the church. These days, though, he mostly helped arrange document sales for other people. He'd recently helped his friend Mark Hoffman, who was a professional antiques dealer, get a $185,000 USD loan to buy some early Mormon letters. Not only that, Steve had tracked down a lawyer whose client was interested in purchasing the letters from Mark at an even higher price. Steve, Mark, and the lawyer were going to meet tomorrow morning to make everything official. But Steve didn't want to think about business right now. He just wanted to enjoy this rare day off with his family. He kissed his wife's shoulder and went back to playing tag with his boys. The next morning, Steve's alarm went off at 7 a.m. He dragged himself out of bed, got ready for work, grabbed his briefcase, and headed to the kitchen. Terry was in there making waffles for the boys, and she asked if Steve wanted to sit down and eat, but he told her he didn't have time. He was just going to grab breakfast on his way to the office, and so he gave his wife and sons each a kiss before heading out the door. Steve drove his Jeep towards downtown Salt Lake City, stopping to buy a box of donuts and a couple of cans of ginger ale on the way. Then he parked his car outside a huge 8-story high-rise building called the Judge Building, where his office was located. The Judge Building was filled with other shops and offices, and even though it was only 8 a.m., there were already plenty of people milling around. Steve waved to some of the familiar faces as he strode toward the elevator. Steve took the elevator up to the 6th floor, and as he approached his office door, he noticed a cardboard box sitting on the ground. It sort of looked like a box that might contain a big cake, like a big square, and on top of this box, written in black marker, it just said, "To Steve Christensen." Steve balanced the 2 cans of ginger ale on top of the box of donuts, and then he carefully bent down and used his free hand to pick up this box. At that same moment, Steve's new business partner, Randy Rigby, was weaving through traffic trying to get downtown. Randy was about 10 minutes late for work, and he'd been trying to page Steve and let him know he was on the way. Steve was not answering. And as Randy approached the Judge Building, he was quite surprised to see all these fire trucks and police cars outside, parked everywhere with their lights flashing and sirens going off. People were gathered around the building, looking curious and concerned. Randy scanned the crowd for Steve, whose tall, broad frame was always easy to spot, but he couldn't see him anywhere. Then he started looking for Steve's Jeep and noticed it parked nearby. Randy walked up to a woman who obviously was from the Judge Building, and he asked her, what's going on here? And she said the whole building had just been evacuated because of some emergency. She said she had no idea what this emergency was. Suddenly, Randy had an unsettling thought. What if Steve didn't know that he needed to get out of the building and he was still in there? Randy needed to make sure Steve was okay. So even though he could see police officers shooing people away from the main entrance, he decided to sneak in. Randy drove his car to the back entrance of the building and quietly slipped inside. He sprinted up 6 flights of stairs, burst into a long hallway, and looked at his and Steve's office door. Except there was no door. The entrance to their office was now a gaping hole framed by splintered wood and chunks of broken drywall. The hallway was littered with debris and coated in dust and ash. Randy's eyes looked to the floor, and he saw there were chunks of burned donuts and also 2 ginger ale cans that had been bust open. Then he saw his partner's mangled body lying amidst the wreckage. His business partner was so obviously dead that the emergency medical workers standing nearby weren't even trying to revive him. The scene was so horrible that Randy could barely process it. Staring at his lifeless friend, all he could think was, who's going to tell his wife? But then, a police officer grabbed Randy's arm and pulled him away from the area. He told Randy the building had been evacuated and he was not supposed to be here. Moments later, Salt Lake City police detectives Jim Bell and Ken Farnsworth reached the same hallway that Randy had just been kicked out of. The men made a good team. Bell was quiet and analytical, while Farnsworth was more talkative and outgoing. The veteran homicide investigators had worked a lot of cases together, but they'd never seen anything like this. Looking at the devastating scene, both detectives were at a loss for words. The victim, who they had learned was 31-year-old Steve Christensen, was unrecognizable. His chest had been blown open, his right foot was nearly severed off, and there were long, heavy nails lodged in his face. Farnsworth cleared his throat and said what both men were thinking. It looked like a bomb went off. The detectives put on gloves and spent the next hour combing the hallway and bagging potential evidence. They found a number of wires, a rocket igniter, and also a motion sensor switch, all items a person could use to build a homemade bomb. Just then, Detective Bell heard the elevator ding, and he turned and saw a scruffy man in a gray sports coat walk out. Jerry D'Elia was unique in the Salt Lake City Police Department. He was a prosecutor, he was also an arson expert, and he was an investigator. A native of New York City, D'Elia had more experience with bombing cases than anybody else on the force. Bell explained what they'd found so far, and D'Elia agreed that it seems like Steve had been the victim of a homemade bomb. But D'Elia said that whoever made it knew exactly what they were doing. Not only did they use a motion sensor switch so the bomb would go off whenever somebody moved it, but they had also wrapped the explosives in nails that virtually guaranteed the bomber's target would be killed in the explosion. In fact, D'Elia said the bomb was so sophisticated that he wondered if maybe this was the work of a professional hitman. But as they discussed the possibility that Steve was killed by a murderer for hire, another police officer came running up the stairwell, accompanied by 2 men who looked very shaken. The men said they owned a jewelry store on the 3rd floor of the Judge Building, and just that morning at about 6:45 a.m., they had rode the elevator up with a man who claimed to be delivering a package. And this man was carrying a cardboard box, and on the box it said, "To Steve Christensen." And so now that the jewelry shop owners had heard what happened, they were pretty certain they'd been inside the elevator with the bomber. Detective Bell asked if they recalled anything about the man's appearance, and the witnesses said he was Caucasian with brown hair, maybe in his 30s, and they remembered that he was wearing a green Letterman jacket. Bell looked over at D'Elia. A 30-something-year-old guy in a Letterman jacket didn't exactly sound like a professional hitman, because that kind of stands out quite a bit, and if you're a hitman, you want to be kind of under the radar. But then again, who was really to say what a real hitman looked like? Before they could talk it over, though, yet another police officer came barreling through the door from the stairwell, wide-eyed and breathing heavily, and he looked directly at Detective Bell and said, "We have another one." Shortly after 11 a.m., about 2 hours after this first explosion, Prosecutor D'Elia pulled up outside a home in the upscale Salt Lake City suburb of Holiday. He saw county sheriff's deputies, TV news reporters, and frightened neighbors crowded outside, all trying to make sense of the horrific scene. D'Elia parked his car, stepped out, and looked over at what was left of a nice brick house. An entire side of the garage had collapsed, and the carefully mowed yard was now covered with debris. D'Elia pushed through the crowd, and then he saw what everybody was staring at. There was a woman's body lying on the front porch. She had wavy gray hair, but her face was obscured by burns and soot, and her left arm had been blown off, and her abdomen had been ripped open. D'Elia didn't know this woman, but seeing her shattered body and destroyed home made him feel furious. Bombings were rare in Salt Lake City, and back-to-back bombings were basically unheard of. So D'Elia was quite certain that the same killer or killers were responsible for both. D'Elia approached one of the deputies who was already on scene and asked what they knew so far. The deputy told him that the victim's name was Kathleen Sheets. She was a 50-year-old schoolteacher and mother, and she was married to a financial consultant named Gary Sheets. Gary was the founder of that failed investment company where Steve Christensen used to work, and the men had a close professional relationship until about 2 months ago when their business went under. Then, the deputy showed D'Elia a piece of cardboard from the box that the bomb came in. There, in black marker on the cardboard, was Gary's name. Apparently, the deputy said, Gary was the bomb's intended target, not his wife. D'Elia thought this over. Two partners whose business recently failed had both been targeted by devastating bombs within hours of each other. D'Elia wondered if someone who had lost money when Steve and Gary's company collapsed might be out for revenge. But D'Elia also thought it was possible that maybe Gary killed his former business partner and his wife and only wrote his name on the box as a diversion. Either way, D'Elia knew exactly who investigators needed to speak to next. Later that morning, Detective Farnsworth sat in an interview room at the Salt Lake City police station across from Gary Sheets. Gary was in his 50s with white hair and even whiter teeth, but his eyes were red from crying. Farnsworth tried to be gentle while asking questions, and Gary was very forthcoming despite his obvious shock and grief. He explained that he and Steve used to run a financial consulting company together, working with wealthy investors. They'd done well until some bad investments left the company on the verge of bankruptcy. Then, 2 months ago, Steve had decided to leave and start his own consulting company with a new partner, leaving Gary to try to deal with the mess of their failed business. But Gary said he didn't have any animosity towards Steve, and he was heartbroken to hear about Steve's violent death. As for his own wife's murder, Gary said he couldn't believe any of this was real. Detective Farnsworth felt sorry for the guy and knew Gary should be with his family right now, but there was a bomber who was loose in Salt Lake City, and his questions just couldn't wait. He asked if Gary knew anyone who might want to hurt him. Gary paused for a moment and then said, well, yeah. When his and Steve's company failed, a lot of investors lost a lot of money. Maybe these bombs were a spurned investor's way of getting revenge. But if this was the case, Gary wondered, why target his wife? Detective Farnsworth swallowed hard and told Gary the bomb had actually been inside a cardboard box and his name had been written on the box. As far as police could tell, someone out there had actually wanted Gary dead, not his wife. Hearing this news, Gary began to cry, not only at the thought of his wife being murdered by mistake, but also because the reality that somebody was out to kill him was terrifying, and he began shaking like he was just so scared he couldn't help it. And so seeing this, Farnsworth immediately offered to place him in protective custody until the police solved the case. In the meantime, they needed Gary to put together a list of all the investors who'd lost money when his and Steve's company dissolved. Any one of them could be the bomber. While Detective Farnsworth wrapped up his conversation with Gary, his partner, Detective Bell, was a few miles away on the couch in Steve Christensen's living room. Steve's very pregnant wife, Terry, sat across from him looking totally numb. A few members of the family had come over as soon as they heard the news, and they took care of Steve and Terry's boys while she spoke with the detective. Her voice was flat as she told Detective Bell that she didn't know how she was going to live without her husband. Beyond the shock and grief of losing someone she loved so much, Terry was now going to have to find a way to support 4 children on her own, and the family's financial situation was not good. She sighed and sort of muttered under her breath that she wished Steve hadn't been so generous with the church. Detective Bell asked what she meant. Terry tucked a strand of her short blonde hair behind her ear and explained that Steve was always spending money on Mormon artifacts. The previous year, in 1984, he'd paid $40,000 for one document and then just handed it over to the church. Detective Bell looked confused. Terry explained that this document, called the Salamander Letter, was valuable because it was so controversial, raising doubts about the founding of the Mormon Church. The church taught that the founder of Mormonism was led to the Book of Mormon by an angel, but the letter said he'd actually been led there by a white salamander. Terry said that Steve's friend, Mark Hoffman, had found the salamander letter from one of his confidential sources, and when word got out that Mark had the letter, church leaders got really upset because it totally went against their teachings. Terry said she didn't want Steve to buy this letter, but he did it anyway. And then he donated the document to the Mormon church. And just like that, Steve and Terry's family had lost $40,000, money that they really needed right now. Detective Bell could see how upsetting this was for Terry. He didn't want to cause her any more grief, so he thanked her for the information and told her how sorry he was for her loss. But before he got up to leave, Terry stopped him. She said she felt like the salamander letter might have something to do with her husband's murder. The letter's discovery caused some Mormons to leave the church, and they might have blamed Steve for shattering their faith. Detective Bell wasn't sure what to think, but he promised Terry he would look into it. The next day, at about 2:40 p.m., Detective Farnsworth cruised down the highway towards the police station. It was only the second day of the investigation, but Farnsworth already felt enormous pressure to solve this case. People were scared, especially after a local reporter had received an anonymous call claiming there were 4 more bombs already planted all around Salt Lake City. And at a press conference the night before, the Salt Lake City police chief had said the crime could be related to this salamander letter. And so, fearing that their affiliation with the Mormon church could make them the next victims, multiple prominent Mormons had taken their wives and kids into hiding. Detective Farnsworth pulled into the police station, but just as he turned off the ignition, he heard an emergency report on the police radio. The dispatcher said all available police needed to head to an address near Main Street in downtown Salt Lake City. Just as the public feared, the bomber had struck a third time. Minutes later, Detective Farnsworth skidded to a stop near a blue Toyota sports car that was still smoldering. A firefighter sprayed water onto the smoking vehicle, and Farnsworth could hear the siren of an approaching ambulance just a few blocks away. Farnsworth jumped out of his car and saw that the entire driver's side of the blue Toyota had been blown apart, and a few feet away, a Salt Lake City police officer was kneeling on the ground, cradling an injured man's head. The man looked like a total wreck to Farnsworth. There were shards of glass in his face, his bloody right hand was missing a fingertip, and he had a piece of metal shrapnel sticking out of his right knee. But somehow, this man was alive. Just then, the sirens reached a fever pitch as the ambulance arrived on the scene. 2 EMTs jumped out of the vehicle and ran over to the injured man and began taking his vitals. Detective Farnsworth leaned down and asked the injured man for his name. In between labored breaths, he said his name was Mark Hoffman. Farnsworth immediately recognized that name. Mark was the man who had discovered the controversial salamander letter and sold it to Steve. But before the detective could ask any follow-up questions, the EMTs loaded Mark into the back of the ambulance and sped off to the hospital. Moments later, Prosecutor D'Elia and a federal agent who specialized in bombing cases arrived on the scene. The federal agent immediately began examining Mark's smoldering vehicle, while Farnsworth got D'Elia up to speed about the latest victim. But just then, the federal agent called out to them to come over and look at what he'd found inside of Mark's trunk. Farnsworth and D'Elia ran to the back of the sports car, and in the trunk they saw a trove of old-looking papers that had been damaged in the explosion. They were either burnt from the fire or sopping wet from when the firefighter had doused the vehicle with water, but they were all there and clearly seemed pretty important. As he looked at the ruined papers, Detective Farnsworth was overwhelmed with questions. Why would someone want to kill Mark Hoffman? Could it be related to the documents inside his trunk? Or could it be someone who blamed Mark and Steve for unearthing the salamander letter that undermined the Mormon faith? And if that was the case, why would the bomber then also target Gary and Kathy Sheets? They were connected to Steve, but they had nothing to do with the buying and selling of Mormon artifacts, and so none of it made any sense. At about 4 p.m. that afternoon, Detective Bell stood in Mark Hoffman's room at the LDS Church Hospital. Mark had all these open wounds on his face from where doctors had pulled glass out, and he was waiting for an operation on his injured leg. Bell felt terrible for him, but on the bright side, doctors said he was likely going to live. Mark was on pain medication, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Detective Bell asked him if he felt well enough to talk, and Mark croaked out a yes. The detective asked Mark where he was going when the explosion happened, and Mark said he was on his way to sell some rare documents to a lawyer downtown. Bell asked what kind of documents, and Mark sort of paused for a minute and then said he couldn't actually remember. He said he couldn't actually recall much of anything from that morning except opening his car door and seeing a small package fall out. Mark said he went to pick up the package, and then everything went black. Detective Bell nodded grimly. He'd heard from people in the Mormon community that Mark was this incredibly talented and charismatic man. Mark was jokingly known as the Mormon Indiana Jones because he was so good at finding valuable artifacts. So to Bell, even though he didn't know Mark, it just seemed so sad that this guy was kind of a shell of himself with virtually no memory of what nearly killed him. Bell asked Mark if he could recall anything from before the explosion. Mark thought for a moment, and then he whispered that he had noticed a brown pickup truck that seemed like it was following him right before the explosion. The truck didn't worry him at the time, but only now, as he thought about it, he wondered if the bomber might have been trailing him. He'd seen through the mirror that the driver was a white man with brown hair, but besides that, Mark didn't get a good look at the guy because, again, it didn't really matter to him at the time. Detective Bell nodded. It sounded like the driver could be the same person the father and son saw in the Judge building. But still, there was a lot of white men with brown hair in Salt Lake City, Utah, so this was not a particularly helpful clue. Just then, a doctor came into the room and said they needed to begin prepping Mark for his leg surgery. Detective Bell thanked Mark for the information and then turned to leave. Two days later, on Friday, October 18th, Bell and Farnsworth sat inside of an interview room facing a man named Shannon Flynn. The detectives had learned that Shannon was Mark Hoffman's full-time employee, helping him find and sell these rare documents. And so if anybody could help investigators understand what was going on in this strange and secretive world of trading Mormon artifacts, it was Shannon. Sitting at the table, Shannon seemed very nervous. But then again, so far 3 bombs had gone off in Salt Lake City, targeting Shannon's boss and another man he routinely worked with, Steve. Shannon admitted that he was terrified of becoming the bomber's next victim. Detective Bell asked Shannon if there was any particular person he felt afraid of, but Shannon shook his head and said no. He told them that a lot of these document sales happened anonymously through people's lawyers or other representatives, so this made the whole situation even more frightening. Somebody could have it out for him, and he wouldn't even know their name. Bell asked if Shannon knew anybody who might want to hurt his boss, Mark, and Shannon said that Mark was having financial trouble related to 2 different document sales. Either one could have made Mark some enemies. Shannon said for the first deal, Mark had asked his friend Steve Christensen for help getting a private $185,000 loan to purchase a collection of antique documents. And now, Mark was having trouble paying back that loan, which had very much upset Steve. But Mark kept telling Steve not to worry because he had an even bigger sale pending. And when that went through, Mark promised he could pay back the loan then. But Shannon said Mark's second document sale had also hit a snag. Mark had acquired the only known copy of the first document ever printed in colonial America, known as the Oath of a Freeman, a discovery so significant that the United States Library of Congress had offered to buy it for $1 million. But the Library of Congress wanted elaborate proof that this document was indeed authentic before they paid such a huge amount for it. And so this delay in the sale was really putting Mark in a very serious cash crunch. Detective Bell asked Shannon if he knew where Mark got the document, but Shannon said no, Mark didn't share the names of his contacts very often. At this point, the detective was starting to feel suspicious of Shannon. It was hard to believe that as Mark's only full-time employee, he didn't know anything about where these documents were coming from. Plus, Detective Bell didn't understand why Mark would have needed a loan to buy artifacts. He knew Mark had made hundreds of thousands of dollars selling antiques, so Detective Bell outright asked Shannon if he knew where all of his money had gone. Shannon suddenly looked down at the table and sort of mumbled that Mark lived far beyond his means. He traveled all the time, lived in a huge house, and drove an expensive sports car. Plus, Mark could be generous almost to a fault. Shannon said that one time Mark had given him money to buy a submachine gun for his firearm collection, and then he also helped pay to convert that submachine gun into a fully automatic gun. When Detective Bell heard this, he tried to keep his expression neutral, but he was shocked. Shannon had just confessed to turning a gun into a fully automatic weapon, which was illegal. Detective Bell glanced at Farnsworth, and he looked just as surprised. Bell quietly asked Farnsworth to step into the hall with him. Once they were out there and out of earshot of Shannon, they both agreed that Shannon seemed very suspicious, and because he confessed to owning an illegal firearm, they had probable cause to arrest him and search his home. So that's exactly what the detectives did. Shannon was immediately taken into custody on the firearms charge, and when Bell and Farnsworth searched his home, they found at least 3 more guns. Then they stumbled on something even more shocking. Shannon owned a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook, a notorious 1970s book that contained instructions for building bombs. Just like that, Shannon shot to the top of their suspects list, and they quickly got another warrant to search more of Shannon's property. It turned out Shannon rented a storage unit, and police suspected that might be where he was constructing bombs. That weekend, Detective Bell arrived at what investigators called the War Room, a big conference room in the Salt Lake City police station where everyone working the case could meet and discuss their progress. Bell sat down with Farnsworth, Prosecutor D'Elia, and the federal agent from the 3rd bombing scene, as well as a number of other law enforcement officials. And they had a lot to talk about. Even though the search of Shannon Flynn's storage unit hadn't revealed anything incriminating, he still seemed extremely suspicious. If the police were right and these bombings were all related to the rare document trade, then Shannon seemed like their only real suspect. But Detective Bell knew that this explanation did not account for the murder of Kathy Sheets. As far as police could tell, Kathy and Gary Sheets had not been involved in buying or selling Mormon documents and had nothing to do with Shannon Flynn. So, Prosecutor D'Elia suggested the investigators go back through the dozens of interviews they'd conducted. Maybe if they reviewed all of the evidence as a group, something would stand out. And so Bell and Farnsworth just began reading their notes out loud, going through every last detail from each person they'd spoken to, and as they did this, suddenly, the federal agent's hand shot up, and he told them to stop. The agent said he'd just noticed something. A detail from one of the interviews didn't make sense. One of their witnesses had to be lying, and he felt certain this person who was lying was the bomber. Immediately, investigators started drafting a court motion to get one more search warrant. And during the search, just a few days later, they uncovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led to a shocking revelation that nobody imagined. Based on the evidence found during police searches, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened during the Salt Lake City bombings of 1985. Late on the night of October 14th, the killer stood at a work table in their basement, putting the finishing touches on 2 homemade bombs. They'd spent the last few weeks researching how to build them, and they felt confident the design would work. The killer taped dozens of long carpenter's nails over one bomb and added extra explosive powder to the second, making both bombs extra lethal. Then they gently placed each bomb into separate cardboard boxes. The killer had already used an ice pick to carve 2 small holes into the bottom of both boxes. Now they carefully threaded the wires from the motion sensor switches in each bomb through these holes. They taped the wires to the outside of the box to keep them separated, and when the time was right, they would connect the wires, activating the motion sensor switch inside that would make the bombs detonate. Satisfied, the killer turned the cardboard boxes back over and taped them closed. They then grabbed a black felt tip marker and wrote on the first box, "To Steve Christensen," and on the second box they wrote, "To Gary Sheets." Finally, the killer padded upstairs and got into bed, satisfied that everything was ready. The next morning, the bomber woke up before sunrise. They slipped out of bed, tiptoed to the basement, and carried each box outside to the car. It was chilly, so they ran back in and put on their old green letterman jacket. Then they got into the car and drove downtown to Salt Lake City. At about 6:45 a.m., the killer parked outside the Judge Building, got out of their car, and lifted the box labeled "To Steve Christensen" out of the back seat. They hoped to slip in and out of the building without being seen, but the moment they walked into the lobby, they ran into 2 people, a father and son. The bomber pretended to be a delivery driver and got into the elevator with these 2 men. These men got out on the 3rd floor, and when the killer reached the 6th floor hallway, they found their way to the office door that had Steve Christensen and Randy Rigby's names written on it. There, the killer knelt down, turned the box over, and carefully connected the 2 wires on the bottom, activating the motion sensor switch inside the bomb. Then they very carefully set the box right side up, Then they casually turned, walked to the stairwell, headed downstairs, outside, to their car, and drove away from the Judge Building. About 15 minutes later, the bomber arrived outside of a big brick home in the suburban city of Holiday. They didn't see any cars parked outside, so they assumed the home's owner, Gary Sheets, had left and would be home later that afternoon. The bomber walked up to the front door carrying the cardboard box. Then they taped the motion sensor wires together and gently placed the bomb near Gary's front porch. After that, the killer turned, walked back to their car, and drove home. When they got there, they opened up the front door, and the house was quiet, so they slipped back into bed without being noticed by anybody else inside. But once the bomber got out of bed, they couldn't resist the urge to turn on the morning news. And at about 8:30 a.m., while they were sipping coffee on the couch, the news broke. A bomb had gone off at the Judge Building, and a man had been killed. The killer pretended to be just as shocked as anybody else in the house was. They even called into work and canceled meetings that day so they could stay home to be safe. Then, less than 2 hours later, local news stations reported the second bombing. But as the killer watched the coverage of this second bombing, they realized their plan had not gone as smoothly as they'd thought. They'd meant to kill Gary Sheets, but the news report said the second victim was a woman. And things got even worse that evening when the Salt Lake City police chief gave a press conference. The killer watched as the police chief said the bombings might be related to a controversial Mormon document called the Salamander Letter. The killer's stomach sank. They couldn't believe the police had zeroed in on the real reason for the bombings so quickly. They had to find some way to get investigators off the trail, and the only way they could think to do that was to create even more chaos. So, late that night, the killer crept down to the basement and constructed a third bomb. The next afternoon, on October 16th, the killer put the bomb in the passenger seat of their car and drove to a busy area downtown. They parked, got out, and then leaned back into the car to turn the bomb over in the passenger seat. They attached the two wires on the bottom of the box, activating the motion sensor switch inside. Then, as they went to take the box out of the car, they jostled it just a bit too hard, and the bomb detonated, sending the killer flying. They crashed into the pavement with shrapnel stuck in their legs and face. They were missing a fingertip, and they were barely breathing. At about 4 p.m. on Wednesday, October 16th, when Detective Bell went to the hospital to interview Mark, he had a lot of questions about how the explosion happened. Mark said he opened his car door and a small package had fallen out, then exploded. But later, when Detective Bell read his notes from this interview aloud to fellow investigators, the federal agent said Mark's story did not line up with the physical evidence. The pattern of damage inside of Mark's car showed the bomb was somewhere near the center console when it detonated, not anywhere close to the driver's side floorboard like Mark had claimed. Now they had caught Mark in what looked like a lie. It was enough for the police to get a warrant to search his home, and there, shoved in the back of a closet, they found a green Letterman jacket, just like the one the bomber wore. But that was far from the most damning evidence. Police also discovered 2 locked rooms in Mark's home, which his wife never entered. The rooms were filled with stacks of old-looking papers, inks, and chemicals. Detectives didn't know what to make of all this until they found a receipt from a local engraving company. The owner of the company told them that Mark had ordered a special engraving plate that would allow him to recreate a famous historical document called the Oath of a Freeman. The same document Mark was trying to sell as authentic to the Library of Congress for $1 million. The detectives soon put 2 and 2 together. Mark Hoffman did not have secret sources who provided him with rare and valuable artifacts. Instead, he'd been forging documents the entire time, which was why he wouldn't tell his employee, Shannon Flynn, where he was getting them from. As for why Mark did all this, money was his most obvious motive. He'd made hundreds of thousands of dollars by forging documents. But he also had another aim. He wanted to embarrass the Mormon church he'd grown up in. Although Mark pretended to be a devout Mormon, he'd stopped believing in the church's doctrines when he was a teenager. As an adult, he started forging papers that would undermine the church's history and shake other people's faith too. The Salamander Letter was totally fake, but it did embarrass church leaders by making it look like Mormonism was inspired by a salamander rather than an angel. And Mark's friend, Steve, had paid him $40,000 for it, believing it was real. Then, in the months leading up to the bombings, Mark had persuaded Steve to arrange a big $185,000 loan to buy a collection of Mormon letters that did not even exist. Mark took the money from Steve and squandered it on fancy vacations and a sports car, and then couldn't repay the loan. So, to get out of this financial hole, Mark forged a copy of the historic Oath of a Freeman that he planned to sell to the Library of Congress for $1 million. But after Mark gave this fake document to library officials to verify, weeks ticked by with no word from them, and he got nervous that experts had found a flaw in his forgery and his whole scheme would fall apart. And at the same time, Mark's friend, Steve, was getting very impatient with Mark for not repaying his $185,000 overdue loan. And so at this point, Mark decided his only option was violence. He murdered Steve to get him off of his back, and then planted a bomb at Gary Sheets' house as a diversion. In reality, Mark didn't care whether Gary lived or died. He just wanted police to think that the bombings were all related to Steve and Gary's failed financial consulting business. And the plan almost worked until Mark made the mistake of setting off a bomb in his own car. He later claimed he did this on purpose in an attempt to commit suicide, but investigators believed Mark actually intended to use this bomb either to kill Shannon Flynn, who was talking to police about Mark's financial problems, or to cause such a scene in downtown Salt Lake City that it would throw the detectives off his trail. Officers arrested Mark Hoffman in January of 1986, and he quickly confessed to both the forgeries and the bombings, but he expressed no remorse for what he'd done. Mark then pleaded guilty in exchange for a life sentence rather than facing the death penalty. Once he was in prison, Mark's wife divorced him, and he was excommunicated from the Mormon Church. Mark later attempted suicide, but he would survive. However, he would permanently damage his right arm, ironically losing control of the hand he'd once used to commit his many forgeries. On the evening of Thursday, May 21st, 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Lily walked into the home gym inside of her house in Hong Kong looking to do a workout. Now, she sort of expected the gym would be empty and she could kind of have the run of the place, but as soon as she walked in, she saw her dad was in there and he was doing some sort of cool-down exercise on a yoga ball. So Lily's dad, whose name was Ka Kim Sun, was a doctor and a professional, and normally at this time of the day, she would never see him in the gym. He was typically locked upstairs in his study, or upstairs doing work or something, or he was just gone for the day. So for him to be here, it just didn't really line up with his schedule. And so Lily asked her dad, what are you doing here? What's going on? And her dad would tell her, well, actually, work at the hospital was really slow today, so I took off, I played some tennis with friends, and now I'm just doing some cool down exercises because I got nothing else to do. But I'll be out of your hair in a second. And sure enough, a couple minutes later, her dad was up and out of the gym, and Lily just began her workout. The next day, May 22nd, around 1 o'clock, Lily was at home at her dining room table, sitting across from her mother, whose name was Wong Siu Fing, and Lily was eating a snack and staring at an open textbook. Now, normally, at 1 o'clock on a Friday, Lily would be at school, but she had had the day off that day. And she had wanted to spend her day off seeing friends and just being a teenager, but her dad was really focused on her being successful academically, and he told her that absolutely not. You're not going anywhere. You are going to stay home and you are going to study all day long. You will not leave the house. That's what you're doing. So Lily just continued to stare at the textbook and basically do what her father said. And then a couple of minutes later, she actually heard her dad coming down the stairs, and he came into the dining room, and he was clearly very pleased to see his daughter doing her work, or at least appearing to do her work. And he came over to her, gave her a kiss, he kissed their mother, and then he said he was off to work. And then he went out the door and he was gone. And as soon as Ka was gone, Lily's mom looked over at her and said, I'm not gonna make you study all day. Come on, let's go out and have a mother-daughter shopping day. And Lily was stoked. She shut her textbook, she went and got ready, and then a minute later, she and her mom climbed into her mom's yellow Mini Cooper car and they headed out. About 2 hours later, around 4:15 p.m., a local jogger was running in the same neighborhood as where Lily and her family lived, and as they were running down the road, they noticed there was this yellow Mini Cooper car sitting on the side of the road, not moving, but it was still on. It was just sort of idling right there. And at first glance, it appeared there were people inside the car, but they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there, not moving. And so the jogger was curious, and so they ran past and made a point to look inside the car, and they saw two women in the front two seats of this car slumped over. The two women were Lily and her mother.
And so the jogger began to panic and banged on the glass to try to get the women to respond, but they didn't. And so a minute later, police were called. They dragged Lily and her mother out of the car. They were totally unresponsive. They were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. They both died. The police would begin their investigation into their deaths by searching the yellow Mini Cooper car. And when they searched it, there really was nothing of note inside of it. I mean, the two women's purses were in the front of the car, there was some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, but the car was pristine, clean, not cluttered. I mean, there really was nothing in the car that gave away what could have happened to these two women. For the next 6 months, the police tirelessly looked for some lead as to what happened to this mother and daughter. They would interview all their friends and family, they would search their house top to bottom, they would basically take apart this Mini Cooper and look for, defects or flaws that maybe could have contributed to their death. I mean, they were looking everywhere, but it just didn't make sense. Nobody had any idea what happened to these two women. And so right as this case appeared like it was about to go cold, the detectives decided to just go back to the Mini Cooper and see if maybe, just maybe, they missed something. And sure enough, they had. It would turn out, on May 22nd, 2015, the day that Lily and her mother died, Lily's father had told Lily to stay home and study, not because he cared about her academics. I mean, he did, but that day, the reason for this was not for that. Instead, he wanted her to stay home all day to protect her. When police originally searched Lily's mom's car, they found the two women's purses and also some basic exercise equipment in the trunk, specifically a deflated yoga ball. And at the time, the police didn't think anything of these items. They looked into them, they considered them, but they didn't seem to have any bearing on what happened to the women. However, it would turn out the yoga ball did have something to do with it. Specifically, 2 days before the women were found dead, that yoga ball was inside of Lily's home. It was in her home gym. In fact, when she walked into the home gym and saw her dad doing cool-down exercises and thought it was strange he was home right now, he was using that yoga ball. And Lily didn't think anything of it. But in reality, what her father was doing was not cool-down exercises. He had not just come home early and, had played tennis and this and that. In reality, he had taken that yoga ball to the hospital where he worked and filled it with carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless, poisonous gas. And his plan was to put the yoga ball in his wife's car, unplug it, and now it's sealed and the gas is going to leak inside the car. And then when his wife got in the car and shut the door, she would effectively suffocate and die. He didn't try to kill his daughter though. He wanted her to stay home and study, i.e. don't go with your mom and get in the car. But the mother defied the father, brought the daughter along, and then after driving for only a mile, the two women collapsed and died. Ka Kim's son was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He has never explained his motive. Our next story is called 120 Times.
In 2019, 21-year-old Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wanted to practice international law. And so in order to do that, she needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish and become quite good at it rather quickly. During her college Spanish studies, one of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jaimes. Daniela very quickly recognized in Samantha that she had this incredible intellect and work ethic and just knew she was destined for greatness. In fact, she compared Samantha to Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife and is considered to be one of the most famous international lawyers ever. And so just out of a general interest to see Samantha succeed, Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish, that she was there to help her with law school applications, or if she needed advice on something, or if she just had ideas she wanted to bounce off of her, she would be available. And Samantha had taken her up on this offer, and by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close, forming a sort of mentor-mentee relationship. Early that year, Samantha got accepted into her target law school, Drexel University in Pennsylvania. And so after telling her mother and father, Samantha ran to Daniela's office to tell her mentor the great news. And the two hugged and laughed and celebrated right there in the office. It was clear that everything was falling into place for Samantha, and Daniela was just very, very proud of her. A few weeks later, on March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. Now, Samantha normally spent a lot of her time studying, even on the weekends, but since she was about a month away from graduation and she was already accepted to law school and really didn't have that much work since it was the end of the year anyways, she decided she could cut loose for that weekend. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called 5 Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina, and it's an area that's full of shops and restaurants and bars, so on the weekends it is packed with college students. Samantha and her friends hop from bar to bar, they're having a great time, and then around 2 a.m., the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog, and while they were there, because it was so crowded, the group of friends got separated. Now, initially, the friends were trying to reconnect with each other through texts and phone calls, but they were just really struggling to locate each other. And kind of in the middle of all that, Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer. And so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. So Samantha leaves the Bird Dog bar on her own. She hops in an Uber and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, after all of Samantha's friends had also finally gone home and then woke up that following morning, they realized Samantha was not in her room. And so they called her, she didn't pick up. They started asking around to other friends who might know where she was, but no one did. And so pretty quickly, Samantha's friends were very, very worried about her because the last they had seen her, she was leaving the bar on her own. And so they were really worried something might have happened to her. And so by 1:30 p.m. that day, on that Saturday, the day after they had gone out, they called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these two men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. Earlier that day, these two men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had had no luck actually finding these birds, and so they were getting frustrated. And so by the afternoon, they had split up and were kind of combing this forest on their own to see if they would have more luck solo. And so Ryan, he posted up next to their truck, which was parked on this dirt road that was butted up against the edge of this big forest. And Ryan, with his binoculars, was scanning out across this field that butted up against the tree line of the forest. And he was kind of scanning the tree line, but he still was having no luck finding any turkeys. And then Anders, he actually had walked into that forest, which was right next to Ryan. And he was just kind of walking around looking for the birds as well, but he too was still having no luck. And so around 4:30 p.m., Anders, who's the one in the forest, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. And so he turns around and begins walking out of the forest in the direction of Ryan. And so at this point, he's maybe 100 or 200 feet away from Ryan, but the trees are very thick and they can't really see each other. And so Anders is just kind of walking in that direction. He's not looking for birds anymore, so he's not scouting around. He's just kind of looking straight ahead. And as he's walking, something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees. It was pretty far away, but he instinctively turned and looked, and he couldn't really tell what it was. It wasn't a turkey, but it wasn't anything that should have been in the forest. And so he decided he would go get a better look. And so he turned away from Ryan and went left and started cutting through the trees. And he kept walking until his view of this thing was no longer obscured by trees. And when he got a full look at this thing that had caught his attention, he stopped where he was. He yelled for Ryan, who couldn't see him, but he yelled for him to come into the woods and look at this. And as Ryan is running into the forest to see what's going on, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. When the police finally show up, they find Anders and Ryan, and they're very shaken up, and they're sitting on the back of their truck on that dirt road where Ryan had been. And so the police pull up to them, they speak to them and get directions of how to get to what they saw inside of the forest. And then the police officers walk into the forest, they follow the directions, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before her body was discovered, Samantha left the Bird Dog bar and walked out front where there's lots of other students, and she walked to this corner of this road right in front of her, and she hailed an Uber. And then the Uber car pulls up, she hops inside, and then the car backs up and drives away. except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland, who was not an Uber driver. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night, presumably to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. And finally, his plan had worked. He'd pulled in right in front of Samantha. She thought it was her car. She climbed in without question. And then once she was inside, she couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. There was no way to open them unless they were opened from the outside. Now, initially, Samantha wouldn't have noticed this. She just sat in the back seat, the car backed up, it started driving, except it didn't drive towards her campus. It drove the opposite direction. And the drive from this bar to the campus was only a couple of minutes long. And so even if she wasn't really paying attention, she would have recognized fairly quickly they were going the wrong way because, again, she's expecting to get dropped off within a couple of minutes. Now, we don't know what actually happened inside that car in terms of how Samantha actually handled this realization that he was taking her the wrong way. We don't know if she confronted him. We don't know if she tried to open the door and then realized it was child locked. We just don't know. All we know is that Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked wherever he was, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the backseat of his car where Samantha was trapped, and he stabbed her 120 times. And then after he was finished stabbing her, it would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Within hours of dumping her body in the forest, Nathaniel was posting these normal posts on Facebook of him in front of his car and regular status updates, and he was having very normal interactions with his family and his friends, as if he was completely unaffected by this horrible crime he had just committed. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. And so he just began prowling around for a victim, and unfortunately, Samantha was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called To Save His Soul. On the evening of September 17th, 2021, a 42-year-old preacher named Jason Thornburg was cleaning up his motel room in Euless, Texas, which is a small city between Dallas and Fort Worth. Jason was going to be hosting a small Bible study group in his motel room in a few minutes, and even though really it was not that dirty, he was really taking time to ensure it was as clean and inviting as he could possibly make it. So normally, Jason would host these Bible study groups at his house, but unfortunately, Jason's house burned down just that past summer and he lost everything. But Jason was so committed to God and spreading the word of God that he still wanted to continue having these Bible study groups, even if it meant, doing it in this kind of crummy motel room. And so Jason walked around the room, picking up laundry and straightening up his bed. And then after kind of arranging chairs in a circle for the various participants he was expecting, he went over to a cabinet, pulled out some Bibles, and right as he was about to start placing these Bibles on each chair, he heard a knock at the door. And Jason was really excited because he knew that had to be someone who was here for this Bible study. And so he walked right over, Bibles in hand, to the door, he opened it up, and standing outside the door was this big guy covered in tattoos, kind of looking down at Jason, and Jason broke into a big smile. He was so happy to see this guy. The man's name was David Luaris, and Jason had previously met him when he was out on the street doing outreach for his church, and he had invited David to, anytime he wanted to come by the motel and be a part of this Bible study group. Now, Jason knew that David was really not the kind of guy who went to church or really showed any real interest in God or, the Bible, but, Jason took all kinds, and he was just hopeful that maybe David would show up someday. And now, here David was. However, David told Jason that the reason he was here was actually not for the Bible study group. He was here because he was in the middle of a crisis and he didn't know where else to turn. He confessed to Jason that he had begun using drugs and gotten mixed up in some criminal activity, and there's some dangerous people out there that he was sort of running with, and now his concern was some of those dangerous people were coming to get him. And so he literally felt like his life was in danger.
Now, when Jason heard this, he was surprised, but at the same time, he could tell that David was being very authentic and just needed help. And Jason felt like, his job ultimately was to serve God and all of God's people. And David was one of those people, and he was in need of help. And so if all Jason did was simply provided safe haven for David inside of this motel room, then that was serving God and it was the right thing to do. And so Jason immediately said, "No problem, David." He handed him a Bible and said, "Come on in." David took the Bible awkwardly and just kind of stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. But then Jason said, "Hey, relax, just come inside, take a seat." And so David did. He walked in, he sat down with the Bible, and then Jason actually came over and sat down next to him, and the two of them, for about 15 minutes, just made kind of awkward small talk. Jason could tell, David is completely on edge. He was staring at the door, which was now closed, and he just clearly was very anxious and paranoid, and Jason really wasn't talking about the Bible or God or anything. He was just, trying to calm David down and show him that this was a safe place. And then after about 15 minutes of this, when David had somewhat calmed down, and also by this point, nobody else had showed up for this Bible study group, Jason decided, okay, you know what, maybe I'll just begin the Bible study with David. It kind of gives us something to do. And so Jason got up, he locked the door, showing David that it's just going to be them, it's safe here. And he told David to go ahead and open his Bible to a certain page. And then the two of them just began reading the Bible together. And for hours, they just sat there reading the Bible. And Jason spoke to David about, teachings of God and how to lead your life in a way to serve other people. And, for the most part, David did completely calm down and seemed to really be embracing this Bible study. But eventually, despite how well this Bible study was going, it did need to come to an end at some point, at least in Jason's mind. And when he began to notice it was getting dark outside, he sort of began wrapping it up and he shut his Bible and sort of expected that David would take a hint and leave, but David didn't. Instead, when David began to realize that, hey, this is over now and it's time for you to go, David looked at Jason and begged him to please let him stay in this room overnight, that he can't go out there, it's not safe for him. Now, Jason knew he did have some level of responsibility for David. I mean, David had told him he was in danger, he had already invited him inside and was basically providing safe haven for him, and it did feel kind of wrong to be like, now go back out there. But at the same time, Jason felt a little uneasy. I mean, he didn't really know David. He didn't really understand the situation. And so there was some hesitation at first, but after looking again at David and seeing how desperate he was to just please stay here overnight, Jason said, okay, you can stay. So Jason grabbed some extra blankets and pillows and created a makeshift bed on the floor. And then after that, the two of them actually reopened their Bibles and just began reading some more from the Bible for a couple more hours, basically another round of Bible study. But eventually, they both were very tired, so they put their Bibles down, they said goodnight, they each climbed into their beds, and they closed their eyes and fell asleep. For the next 5 days, Jason's motel room remained mostly closed, and the only thing anybody heard coming from his room was gospel music, and it was being played at a very high volume basically the entire time, to the point where other residents of this motel began to complain about how loud the music was. However, the owner of the motel was getting these complaints from residents who were only there for, hours at a time or days at a time. And, the room they're complaining about, Jason's room, he was a long-term resident and so had a sort of higher priority with the owner. And so the owner just didn't feel like bothering Jason. He wanted him to stay and keep paying for that room. And so the owner didn't do anything about the noise complaints. And also, the owner did know that his motel had sort of a seedy reputation. And so, generally speaking, he didn't really care too much about the music to begin with. And so over the course of these 5 days, the music kept on blasting, and really the only other thing of note, again, that happened in this period of time, was that these two other people entered Jason's motel room and didn't leave either. So basically there's 4 people in the room, they haven't come out again, super loud music, that's all going on for 5 days. And then on the 5th day, the morning of September 22nd, a single person walked out of Jason's motel room, and they were wearing a full-body hazmat suit and carrying some sort of luggage. And they would leave the motel, get in a car, and drive away. 45 minutes later, about 25 miles away from that motel, the Fort Worth Fire Department got a call about this raging dumpster fire in a residential neighborhood. Firefighters quickly got to the scene and put out the blaze, and after it was gone, they walked up to the smoky dumpster and looked inside just to get a look at what was burning, and what they saw caused them all to back up and call the police. It would turn out David was right when he said he was in danger. However, what he didn't understand is hiding out in Jason's motel room was not going to protect him from that danger. Shortly after he and Jason wrapped up that second Bible study that night, and the two of them climbed into their respective beds, Jason in his actual bed and David in the makeshift bed on the floor, well, David did fall asleep pretty quickly, but Jason didn't. Jason waited until David was asleep, and then Jason got up, got a knife, and then slit David's throat. Then he cut David's heart out and ate it, because Jason the preacher really actually believed that human sacrifice was the best and purest way to serve God. Over the course of the next 5 days after killing David, Jason would remain in his motel room blasting gospel music, and over those 5 days, he would basically lure those two women into his room, very likely on the promise of Bible study, but they too would be sacrificed. And then on the 5th day, the person who exited the motel room in the full hazmat suit was Jason, and that luggage he was carrying with him contained the body parts of the 3 people he had just killed. And he brought those body parts to that dumpster in that residential neighborhood and lit them on fire. And so when the firefighters put out the fire, what they saw inside were burned up bodies. Jason was arrested, and while he was awaiting trial, he confessed that David and the 2 women were not actually his first victims. He said that just a few years earlier, he had sacrificed his girlfriend, and that house fire that destroyed all of his belongings and prompted him to go live in this motel was set by Jason himself, because he had sacrificed his roommate and needed to get rid of the evidence. Ultimately, law enforcement was only able to show that Jason killed those 5 people, but there could have been more. Jason was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Texas.
Calls her name when the night grows thin. I stand outside where the light can't win. In the quiet I taste her in his words, love's reflection beautifully blurred. Every heartbeat hides a lie, but I keep dancing in the night.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballin podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballin YouTube channel.